So, Tom, I noticed you have penned a column for the Journal de Montréal,
Yeah,
which has to do with the fact we just heard on the news. I don't know if you happen to hear it. The announcement today that there are
yeah,
some more bureaucrats to run our transport department. This will go along with the ones running our healthcare department. And I guess the point you're making here, and I know you brought this up before, is how out of touch it is to have those not based here. So,
yes.
explain.
And I have to say, both in the article in today's Journal de Montréal, or it's actually online today, in the paper tomorrow, but I'm making the argument that this is actually a very good move by Francois Legault. If I'm going to beat him up when I disagree with him, I got to be fair and say when I do agree with him. And I think that here he's spot on. This idea of creating a standalone agency where you can hire people at a higher level than the normal public service, because they've been driving the thing into the ground. This is a good idea. There is a Canada Revenue Agency, and it works. There's now, Canada Post now works because it's a different type of agency within the government. It's not just the ministry anymore. We don't have a postmaster general anymore, and it works. So sometimes having these agencies that can stand alone, a little bit more autonomy, certainly flexibility in hiring. Sorry to use the shop warren term we're using here in Quebec, but the top guns, even if you're paying them $500,000, which is market, fine, go get the job done. But it's a self-defeating maneuver because it just can't get away from the reflex. They're setting them up in Quebec City. So how are you supposed to set something up to fix the problems in the healthcare system that are largely concentrated in metropolitan Montreal if you're setting them up in Quebec City? I mean, it's just going to be the same bureaucrats moving across the street to something else and changing the signage. You're not going to get any further ahead. The deputy minister, for heaven's sakes, of the health department, which is one of the worst in the Quebec government, is going to be sitting at the table of this new agency. So if you really wanted to follow through, move the thing to Montreal, hire your top guns, make the deputy minister take his car once a month to come to a board meeting in Montreal if he really wants to. And that's the end of it, because Quebec City is a lovely city. It's one of the prettiest cities in North America, but the public service itself has huge, huge, huge problems.
I want to make sure I heard you say you were lauding Canada Post a minute ago, were you not?
I am.
Did,
I think Canada Post is one of the best run agencies in the Canadian government. If you know
yeah.
if you know the landscape of the federal public service. Now, of course, this is the same federal public service that Mr. Trudeau has increased by 42% since he came to power 8 years ago, even though the Canadian population has only gone up 14%. And it's also the same place where, that's 109,000 new people that we've added. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, this is where the public servants are saying they're going to go on some sort of strike action because they're so upset because they're being told they have to come into the office 3 days a week. Imagine. What an outrage. That was the actual word that they used. This is an outrage.
I just want to go back to Canada Post. I had one of their VPs on this week. They lost $748 million last year.
I know they did, and that's why they're raising the price of stamps. But if you look at what's happening in terms of the deliveries that are being done by the private companies that are all over the roads all the time, yes, they have to have some way of fighting back. But when you compare it to the rest of the public service in Ottawa, top notch.
Are you surprised? I mean, given this, and we talked about this before, this bloated public service that we have, and this
Yep.
sort of announcement aside today about this, oh my God, we can't go back 3 days a week. Do you think this is something the Conservatives should have been talking or should be talking more about, or are they talking about this enough? And do people care?
This is where I start to admire Poilievre and especially the people around him, but Poilievre to the extent that he's starting to listen to the very smart people around him. Because this, for him, is kryptonite if he throws his mug into the middle of the target and gives a stack of cream pies for the unions to hit him with. He just stands back, uses very bland sentences. Well, when we come to power, we're going to make sure Canadians are getting value for their money in the public service, blah, blah, blah. These public servants are targeting Trudeau. They're so mad at Trudeau that they're begging Singh to pull the plug on his deal with Trudeau and call an election to get rid of Trudeau. So you can just imagine, these are the same public service unions that Trudeau bent over backwards to sign these juicy collective agreements last year. By the way, under those collective agreements, there's nothing to stop the government from doing exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they're basically complaining against themselves because those are the collective agreements they signed. But well, we sort of had a letter of intent on the side that's not in the collective agreement, and this is an outrage. Yeah, right. Here, look, I was an elected official in a Quebec public service union for the professionals 40 years ago, when René Lévesque said he was going to cut our salaries by 20%. That was an outrage, and that was a real fight. Being told you have to go in to the office 3 times a week, that's an outrage when they've got guaranteed jobs for life, really high rate of pay, fewer hours than other people, and they've got a fabulous pension scheme and longer vacations. The average Canadian's having trouble paying their groceries, unemployment is rising, and they're complaining that they've got it so rough because they have to come in 3 times a week. Penalty flags all over the field, Aaron. And I think that if they had been doing it on purpose to help Poilievre win the next election, they wouldn't have done it any differently. He just has to stand back, let Canadians get outraged about what's happening, and he's going to start picking it up. He doesn't have any reason to have the fight with the civil servants right now. His own riding is in the Ottawa area. He wants to win all the other ones if he can. So he's going to just let Trudeau get beaten up over this thing. There's an old saying in politics, do nothing to interfere when your opponent is beating himself up.
So you obviously, you know that Jagmeet Singh is on board with the public servants now, right? He's already come out and said that. The NDP are on their side. Right.
Of course he's on side with them, but is he going to pull the plug on Trudeau?
No.
Never. So, I mean, it's cheap for him to, if he's really on side, he would do what they're begging him to do, which is to pull the plug on his deal with Trudeau, which, of course, he won't do because he's terrified of having an election right now.
Can I just go back to one thing really quick? And this idea, again, of having these agencies, which you think is a good idea, the ones that CAC are setting up, but not having them in Montreal. Do we have to just look back at this and go, this is never going to happen because we know that Montreal to the CAC is completely unimportant. They have 2 seats on the entire island. Why would they give us anything?
Exactly. And that's why he's doing it. And that's why, despite the fact that it's a very good idea in terms of the history of what works and what doesn't work in public administration, it really is doomed to fail if they keep it in Quebec City. And I spent decades, in Quebec City. I worked there. I worked in the public service. I'm not doing this based on theory. I know which ministries work, which ones don't. The ministry that has caused all of the problems in the health sector is on Avenue Joffre in Quebec City. It's not going to get better. You're not going to make it better. I've always joked that the way to fix the health ministry is with a tube of crazy glue, because when all of them are gone at 4:15 in the afternoon, you put some crazy glue in the locks and you don't let them back in, and then maybe you can start fixing the health sector. Short of that, create a standalone agency, hire some top guns, hire some people who know what they're doing, but don't let the people cross the street from the health ministry into that thing, because it's just going to be the same underperformance.
Does that mean that Geneviève Biron, who got hired, was the right choice?
She's a great choice. She's a phenomenal choice. That company is a great success. She ran it. She knows all about it. She is just the absolute best person to be doing that. But is she going to be able to do it with the same group of people crossing the street? Okay. I don't think so. If your company went bankrupt because you had serious problems with your personnel, and then you're obliged to basically, just change names and try to keep it going with the same group of people, it ain't going to work. And it's the same thing here. It's the equivalent of bankruptcy, the Health and Social Services Ministry in Quebec City. It's not going to work.
Last question real quick. I know this happened the other day. Pierre Fitzgibbon, when asked about it, not saying necessarily he's going to stick around through even the end of his term right now.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically turned himself into a lame duck. People that I know who work with him, Aaron, are very nervous. I mean, this guy just pushes all the rules aside, wants to get stuff done, an impatient businessman, but he's got to respect the rules of the government. He's already been banged out a few times by the ethics commissioner. I quite like the style, frankly, because it shows a desire to get things accomplished and pushing aside rules that he considers too bureaucratic, but you can't do that. If you're the guy making the rules, you can't disobey the rules. And I have already heard since Christmas that he was planning to leave in June. Now, he says he wants to stick around until he sees his big reform of the energy sector adopted. That would only be like next fall, maybe November, December. Is he going to bother sticking around after already having signaled this week that he's ready to pack it in? I'm not sure that he will.
Is this a big loss for the CAC if he does leave?
Huge loss. But look at what's happening around the go right now. Top people they're just leaving the ship. Top advisors around the go, they're looking at the writing on the wall. They're saying, I might as well cash in. I've been doing this for 6 years. I'm exhausted. Nothing's changing with Legault. The other thing that I'm getting back is, Legault is Legault. He does not listen. We talk about Poilievre learning how to listen to advice and starting to do better and better. Legault doesn't listen to advice, and he's convinced that he's got the answers, and it's just not going well.